So we're out filming with the Nutrabaits team. It's mid-October, so well into autumn, though you'd never know it with this the warmth of the sun. I thought I'd talk about how my fishing changes from full summer fishing through to autumn and then winter fishing, and it's all a gradual progression really. Early in the summer and through the summer I tend to be baiting quite heavily when I'm fishing, and also keeping bait going at the end of sessions and between sessions to try, keep the groups of fish feeding on my baits. As we get into autumn, because they've seen a lot of pressure, action starts to slow as water temperatures drop. I tend to reduce the bait I'm using when I'm actually fishing, but I still keep the bait going in at the end of sessions and between sessions. I'm tending to spread it over a wider area to try and keep as many fish feeding regularly as possible. That's really a prelude to going straight into winter, and I think if people stop baiting altogether, the fish stop feeding, and that's what makes winter catching less consistent. So I'm looking to keep them feeding and keep them moving about and finding that bait ready for the actual proper winter. As we get into autumn and the water temperatures start to fall, I think that the fish initially do tend to move into the slightly deeper water, which is a more consistent temperature. But on days like this, particularly when there's weed in the margins and what have you, I do think the weed will hold the heat a lot longer, and you'll find that the carp will move close in. So today I've got one either side of the peg, just at the edge, in where the weed starts, and another one further, and the middle one's further out into the deeper water. I think that's people immediately. I know people who immediately go for deep water as soon as we get into October, November time. But I think that's a bit of a mistake. The carp are still very active. Water temperatures are still well in double figures, and I think the fish are still really in their summer areas. Tactics wise, I'm playing it really safe at the moment. This is just the start of the session, so I've put a little bit of code pellet in. Small pellets which have been well doused in code liquid, very few boilies, just half a dozen over each rod, and I'm fishing a code wafter. The idea being that they've seen a lot of this bait through the summer, and I'm just trying to give them something that they're familiar with, that they'll feed on when they recognise it as food. The pellets, particularly the small ones with a lot of liquid in, is to get a lot of smell into the water without much food available. So hopefully it'll keep them in the swim a bit longer, rooting about, and give them more chance to take the hook bait. Regarding hook baits, presentations, etc., I tend to match my hook baits and the presentation I use to the amount of bait I'm using. So vast majority of the time, from late spring through the summer, etc., I tend to be using wafters or bottom baits straight out the bag, because I'm using a lot of freebies with them. I tend to quite heavily bait. And then as we get into winter, I tend to go back on the pop-ups. Once I think that the fish aren't feeding as heavily, but they're more, I'm looking to ambush fish what aren't really feeding heavily, then I think pop-ups are a definite advantage, and I'll tend to use pop-ups most of the time through the winter. Occasionally wafters, depends on the response to the baiting scenario, what I'm fishing, to be honest with you. If I'm getting a fair bit of action even in winter, like I did last winter, I tend to stuck on the wafters through the winter. But as we get into spring and fish are starting to wake up, as I feel that bit of the warmth of the sun on the back, I do switch over to pop-ups, and I found they're very effective when you're trying to just pick up the odd fish. And it's really single fishing, and I say then baiting between sessions, putting a fair bit of bait in, but when you're actually fishing, just fishing singles, and you can't beat a pop-up for that, I don't think. Well, I mean, the idea that carp will go on a heavy feeding spree in autumn is valid as it is in spring. But again, it will depend on the venue that you're fishing. Some heavily stocked waters, you'll see that a really marked increase in feeding as the temperature starts to drop. But some more sparsely stocked venues where there's a lot of natural food, etc., I think you'll see less of that phenomenon. The carp, on the venues that are fish, it's generally relatively low stock, big fish waters, with a lot of natural food, and I'm looking to wean them onto my bait through the summer, spring and summer, and keep them actively looking for my bait, through the whole 12 months, and just, you know, by my own tactics, changing how I fish for them, you know, to sort of hopefully my tactics to coincide with how they're feeding at the time, like quite heavily baiting early doors in the spring and early summer, because they're looking for food and protein to, you know, for their spawning period, etc. And then hopefully into summer, as temperature rises, keep that bait going in consistently, and, you know, reap the rewards of that. And then I say, as autumn comes and the big change, I tend to reduce the bait I'm actually using when I'm fishing, but keep the bait going in between sessions. And that is to try and keep them active well into the cold water period of the winter. I think, another thing anglers should think about is that a lot of waters nowadays are dominated by bait boats. And bait boats are hugely effective, particularly fishing against features, etc. You know, reduction in disturbance, and they can be a great edge, but they can also be overused, and people get a very stereotype when they're fishing with bait boats. They tend to drop an hook bait with a group of baits, and depending on the depth, you don't get a great deal of spread on the spot you're fishing. And that kind of approach, early doors, will work really well with fish, but it is a very stereotyped approach, and one thing that carp are wary of is being caught from the same type of trap regularly. And so you can, I think, use the fact that vast majority of anglers are using that kind of approach to your advantage by going back. You can still use your bait boat, but you can use them just to drop hook baits and then spread freebies over a wider area using a stick or a catapult. And that's one of the tactics I use a lot on the venues where I fish, because they are quite heavily fished, and you know, again, dominated by people using bait boats. So I tend a lot, particularly through the summer, is to fish single hook baits, but then stick a lot of bait over the top of it, but over a wide area. I mean, people tend to think, I think, because of the use of bait boats, that to get a pickup, your hook bait's got to be within, you know, a foot of any freebies. But that's not the case. Carp are very mobile creatures, and I think if you can spread them, even for one rod, even over something the size of a tennis court, I think you will find that the fish will still pick up your hook baits, and they definitely find them safe there. And I have a theory as well, is I have a good track record of catching big fish in comparison to the number of fish I catch, and I do think a lot of that is because I tend to fish singles amongst spread bait, because I think some of them bigger fish, being older, tend to you know, are very wary of tight groups of bait on the bottom, and I think they tend to be the ones that don't generally feed at what we recognise as feeding time, but they'll pick up singles, you know, during the day, say in the middle of the day when you're not expecting a take. And I found that a lot on heavily pressured waters.